Before we dive into the post biblical history of the church and its worship, let's first lay the groundwork of some of the historical events and settings around the church during and right after the New Testament era. So, we're going to look at the historical and cultural climate of the early church up through the the reign of Constantine and his efforts and ultimately his edict to make Christianity a legal religion in the Roman Empire. And then which is in the early fourth century, and then throughout the fourth century, Christianity rises in popularity or population for sure until by the end of the fourth century it is the to a various varying degrees the official religion of the empire. But so let's start with the climate of the Roman culture and the Roman religious culture in the first century AD. So, looking at this world that the early church is seated in, we have to remember that it is polytheistic. And that Rome has conquered the known world, the Mediterranean, more or less, the Mediterranean world, and it has, by doing so, conquered many different religious people groups. And what they have done is they have not forced those other people groups to change their belief systems to no longer worship their local gods. Instead, they simply introduce to the region the Roman gods as well, which really Rome got their gods from Greece, or kind of found a synthesis or a synergy between them and adopted Latin names for them. But also sometimes would bring the gods of the provinces that Rome conquered, would find their way into the grander ethos of the Roman Empire and even to Rome itself. One such example is a non-Roman or Greek god. Isis was, yes, Isis was a goddess, was actually popular among the Roman army and Roman soldiers, especially, and around the first and second centuries CE AD. So the 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 one rule that they had about polytheism was you could keep your gods, but you had to also worship the gods of Rome in order to pay homage and keep them appeased and happy. The one exception to this was the one monotheistic religion, which was Judaism. Judaism was allowed to simply pray for Rome, the good of Rome, and rather than praying to Rome or pray, and because and part of the Roman pantheon was the worship and the increasingly worship of the Roman emperor. That the emperor was viewed increasingly as a divine being, and or a man made into that had become God or godlike. And so there was worship paid to Caesar that needed to be given to Caesar. And as long as the polytheists of the other regions of the Roman Empire also worshipped and prayed to Caesar, they could keep worshiping and praying to their local gods. Um, Judaism was completely opposed to this notion, and it was antithetical to their faith. And Rome made an exception for Judaism, saying you can pray for the good of the emperor, for but rather than praying to the emperor, because of the Judaism and then Christianity rejecting all other religions, you actually, or and all other gods, you actually hear writings. You can read writings about the Jews and Christians that call them atheists because they reject all the other gods except their own. So the very fact that they reject the pantheon of Roman gods classified them as atheists. The Roman religion, then, so you have all of these gods. Why do we have all of these gods? Well, we have them for personal benefit. It, what is commonly discussed is that worship of a deity in Roman culture, for the most part, was, for most people, was a means to an end. Cicero, a famous philosopher and a statesman, is famous for saying, "I of Rome is famous for saying, I give so the deity may give." It's a tick for tack. Put the coin in, pull the lever, get return type of relationship with the Roman gods. If you want fertility, you want more children, you go to the god of fertility, you give an offering, and you expect a return. You want a success in war, you give to Mars, the god of war, and you expect a return, and so forth. So the reality is that this is a self-centered faith, and that has one exception to one religion is allowed to have an exception to worshiping and paying homage to the emperor, and that's Judaism. And when Christianity would increasingly find itself and Judaism distancing apart, or I should say, the Messianic believers that were Jews, and then the Gentile converts that joined that aspect of the faith, found themselves drifting from the non Messianic Jews. Eventually, Rome came to recognize believers in Jesus as something different than non-believing non-believing or non-messianic Jews, and so the Christians no longer received the protection of the official exemption that Judaism uh, enjoyed. And so this led to not constant and chronic imperial persecution throughout the 300 years until Constantine, but instead regional and limited times, and a few times it was empire wide, but never for too long of a period. So, what, in addition to worshiping the gods of Rome that we can think of, Apollo, Mars, Jupiter, whatever else you want to talk about, there's also a family religion. There's a prayer and praying and giving offerings um, to the family members that had gone before us, your ancestors. And so the father of the family was called the paterfamilias. He would lead like a priest of his home, and they would have a shrine, especially of some kind in the house. The more wealthy would have more elaborate shrines. They would give offerings and pray for omens, or the penates is the household gods, like this. The majores are dead relatives. The genius is your own personal power. So you would pray to your dead relatives and to gods for for your spiritual power, and even you could pray to and for your genius, or pray to the genius of someone else. The lararium was this household shrine that these gods would be placed in. About anything went as far as worship to deities was concerned for Rome. They were fine with almost any and all worship expressions of various tribal or regional faiths, except for human sacrifice. And yet they did allow for infanticide, as far as deciding that you didn't want to keep a child for whatever reason. Um, Note this was something strongly held against in early Christian writings. We'll read the Didache this week, and you'll see in there a stance against both infanticide and abortion, intentionally losing a child. Um, let's talk about. I mentioned that the emperor came increasingly to be recognized as some type of uh, godlike being and even truly divine. They came to be temples created for and to Caesar, Caesarea or Augustus. Worship was offered not necessarily just to the emperor, but to the emperor's genius. So remember from the last slide, his spiritual power. So you give offering to the emperor's spiritual power. And at times, this was actually consistently required for government officials in the post by the time of Jesus and later, at times it became mandatory for everybody during key times of unrest when the empire began to lose its grasp on regions or began to hit financial troubles or plagues would break out. They would the Rome and their religious elite would say this is because we have allowed too many people to not worship the gods of Rome and not worship and pay honor to the emperor, and so they would make it mandatory for all imperial citizens, all people living in the empire, not just their citizens, to make offerings to the emperor. Decius was a key example of this around 250. He actually caused, during this persecution, um, I believe it was Tertullian, or he may have been later, or no, it would have been Cyprian of Carthage at this point, is goes into exile, leaves Carthage, and leaves the empire to hide from having to practice emperor worship. Um, and again, because of their official stance with the empire, the Jews could pray for the emperor. Christians did not have this official exemption agreement with the empire. We see this happen again with Diocletian. And if you did pay worship to and give worship, you would burn incense and make a prayer to the emperor. If you did participate in this worship, you were given what's called a libellus, or libelli plural. It was a certificate of completion, which this is actually a libellus from, I believe, the Decian persecution, showing this person would have proof of their worship of the emperor. And this was required to buy goods, to travel, to participate in the economy of the empire. You had, in these seasons, you had to present and show your libellus that you would have to carry around with you, have in your hand, to show as proof of kind of renewed citizenship and validated citizenship, not unlike the language of the mark of the beast in the book of Revelation. Okay. Emperor worship included not just prayers and incense offered to the genius of the emperor, but also hymns were written praising and lauding the emperor and how he played a role in many divine actions. That these hymns shaped, Gordley writes about in Christological hymns, his book on Christological hymns. He talks also about the hymns of the Roman imperial cult. And he writes that they shaped the worldview towards an imperial cult, the unconquerable power of Rome, that you came to see that these songs tried to shape your worldview to see Rome as this like fully unconquerable, perfect reality. And they would do this as they conquered new territories. They would introduce these hymns to the god Augustus and the goddess Roma, or Rome. There were special choirs created just to sing praises to Augustus. There were hymn instructors and hymn singers that this is what they did, that they didn't sing for any other deity necessarily. They sang specifically for the emperor. Horace is another famous author from antiquity around this time that wrote odes of praise to Augustus, to the emperor, to Caesar, highlighting the safety, the Pax Romana, the peace and prosperity and the rule of law that came as benefits of the Augustus and benefits of the empire. Aspects of Paul's theology, some authors have realized, echo the poetry and propaganda of these hymns, especially from the Augustus and Nero eras. So Paul actually was probably put to death by Nero. He was executed, probably ordered by Nero himself in the 60s AD. And Paul is using language that is intentionally borrowed and subversive of into the declaration of the Roman peace and Roman safety and Roman authority. He uses that language and vocabulary to twist it and point to, no, instead Jesus is the true Son of God and the true bringer of peace, the true Prince of Peace. So in this climate where Christianity finds itself situated against the empire that it is living inside of and living alongside of, what does the Christian life look like? What's interesting is in early writings of all the early writings of the Church Fathers, which is up through at least Augustine in the 400s, we see no mention of intentional evangelizing. This is because their faith's illegal. They're practicing an illegal religion that runs counter to the divine claims of the empire. It's a subversive faith that runs against the civil authority of the land, not in a active militant way, but in a upside down kingdom sort of way. Instead, what drew people to the faith rather than constant evangelizing was a insanely charitable lifestyle. Even to the point where if the church knew of someone in need, they would give any and all, they would give freely, just like the book of Acts talks about the church in Jerusalem giving freely and they're having all in common, and there was no lack. And if there's documentation of that at times the church didn't have enough funding to help the person in need that had come to their attention, they would fast in order to save money on food, to have enough money to afford to give to the cause that the person in need. If they needed to pay to get someone out of jail and they didn't have enough money to do that, they would fast until they did. They would save on food money. Alan Kreider calls all of this the Christian habitus. These habits of life that were a second nature, a learned second nature to the believers, that was crafted through discipleship and worship and catechesis, instructional worship, until the lifestyle of the once pagan or would have transformed into this completely different worldview and completely selfless and self-giving and position of generosity and gratitude. So you see, because this is an illegal religion, we largely see house churches until we start seeing first house churches that then some elder or not elderly wealthy people would then take properties that they owned or large houses they owned and start retrofitting them or changing them into be able to hosting larger numbers of people. And then sometimes there were official buildings built for the church, the people in a city. They would be able to pool money and build a building for worship and community and for the community. Um, and they would gather in these places for prayer, for songs, for shared meals, or for fasting and praying. A few things that the Christians did not participate in that were key expressions of imperial life were theater, gladiator fights, and chariot races. So let's talk about this is an illegal religion. The Christian faith is. Tertullian around the 200 says the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. What would happen, even though persecution was regional and sporadic, what we would see is the times of persecution when believers were being put to death were also the times of the greatest growth in the faith. We see Nero be one of the first persecutors of the faith in the 60s, and this was mainly centered around Rome. We see Domitian do it in around 95 CE, Pliny the Younger, and Trajan the emperor, then Hadrian the emperor a bit after him. Uh, but Hadrian would actually issue that persecution towards Christians should not look like mob raids. So at times there were mobs happening, but then the empire was like, listen, we're not going to just attack people and raid people on hearsay of what their faith is. We're going to do this in a lawful way. Whether that makes it much better, I don't know. Martyrdom was in some ways, though, so common, so much of the ethos and so much on the minds of believers that sometimes it actually became a pastoral problem where, especially younger people, younger believers, would actually seek martyrdom and try to get caught, kind of thing, as a Christian in order to show their devotion and faith to the Lord. So pastors are trying to help, and bishops are trying to help guide people away from that. Kind of be like, listen, like Paul says, to live is Christ. To die is gain, but to live is Christ. We see stronger persecution the further into the further away from the life, death, and resurrection of Christ, the further towards Constantine in the 300s, the more persecution tends to ramp up. Marcus Aurelius actually created a spy network, and that caused thousands of martyrs to come out of this. So this actually created to where they would have to post when Christians would gather in house churches for worship during Marcus Aurelius. They would actually have to have guards or almost like ushers at the front door, and you weren't allowed in unless the usher, like bouncers, knew who you were, or you had a letter of recommendation from someone the church knew. So this became important to carry letters of recommendation for believers if they were moving or traveling from one town to the next and they wanted to be able to worship with their fellow brothers and sisters in the Lord in another city or town. They would need a letter of recommendation from a recognized name. Severus is persecution, again, regional in Egypt and North Africa. Maximinius only goes after the leaders, um, which actually caused even more problems. When he would put leaders to death, you'd see far more believers come in response to that. This leader wasn't all about show or power or something, that it was authentic. Decius, like we talked about, made emperor worship mandatory. You would have to show the libellus to participate in daily life. The goal with Decius, because of how much Maximinius's persecution and those before it had backfired of putting people to death for lack of practicing emperor worship and polytheistic worship, he instead aimed for, he did still go after the leaders, but he aimed for recantation, not execution. He did not want to let Christian leaders be able to be martyrs that would then stoke the flame of revival. Again, stronger persecution comes under Valerian as we move into the second half of the 3rd century. Um, Christian leaders again are killed here. Again, that doesn't really work. It backfires. The church continues to grow impossibly, grow in the face of persecution. Gallienus actually persecutes for a while, but then orders an edict of toleration, which returns lands and buildings to Christians that had been confiscated during past persecutions. Diocletian is one of the most severe persecution seasons. He mandates again public emperor worship. Buildings are torn down, documents are burned, and it is a rampage of martyrdom across the empire. And this runs right up to 311 with Galerius, puts out an edict of toleration. There's still um, smoldering of persecution and resistance culturally, but then Constantine has another edict of toleration in 313 called the Edict of Milan, which makes Christianity a recognized legal religion of the empire. Now, all of this persecution I'm talking about state, not just sanctioned, but state operated persecution against the church, not for any other behavior than their prayer and worship of Jesus Christ and declaring Jesus Lord and not Caesar. They're persecuted because they refuse to honor and pay and worship the nation they live in, the empire they live in. It is not persecution over any other aspects than that. Now, like I said, this is state sanctioned and state operated persecution. What I'm not talking about here is then even in between, you have in between these pockets of intense persecution, you have a range of how much culturally Christians are allowed to fully participate in society, even when they're not being hotly attacked. So becoming a Christian, even in times that it wasn't officially, you weren't actively being persecuted by the state, it may have cost you business sales. It may have cost you friends and relationships, and it may have cost you your place of status in society. No, regardless of what field you were coming from, what background you had. And so this is what I'm talking about here is persecution is life threatening. There was also a cultural current of distrust for Christians that manifested in various other lacks of toleration in smaller ways. So this is the setting of worship in the second, especially in the second and third centuries, the 100s and 200s AD, which is what we're going to look at in another video, is during this season of having to worship with one eye on the door, having to pray with one eye open and one ear listening for footsteps outside. What does the community of Christ look like as they gather wherever and whenever they are able to? What does it look like to have a faith that is socially costly? And what does it look like to still honor and practice that faith? That is what we will look at next.